Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. We have a really important panel today that will give us a sense of the region from different international institutional perspectives. We have two senior officials from the World Bank and the IMF. We have our famous former dean and current professor, Vali Nasser. So I'll hand it over for a minute to Vali to welcome everybody, and then I'll come back and introduce the speakers.
Thank you very much, Hafid. It's great to welcome everybody to this event, which is co-sponsored between the North Africa Institute and the SAIS Middle East program, and to see both students, faculty, and also members of the public here. This is a very timely topic. Obviously, the Middle East is in the news for issues of conflict these days, but the region's economy has been subject of great interest, particularly after the pressure that it felt during the COVID era, and now with the issues that have to do with the security situation in the region, the future of the North African countries, as well as Middle Eastern countries, how they deal with the economic sets of issues and what kind of an impact it has on its political stability are important. So we're really fortunate to have the panel today. Hafid would give a full introduction of our panelists, our representatives from the World Bank, IMF, and also the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace as a Middle East program, which is one of the leading Middle East programs and working on North Africa and the Middle East in Washington, D.C. So we will have a very fruitful conversation today. So with that said, Hafid, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. We'll hear more from Vali later, but here's the quick run of the program. We're going to start with Roberta Gatti, the Chief Economist for the Middle East and North Africa at the World Bank Group. Then after that, we'll go to Khalil, who is the Deputy Director of the Middle East and North Africa. And in the IMF, they add Southeast Asia, I think, right, for the program. So the two most senior people in charge of the region. Then we have Amr Hamzawi, Director of the Middle East and North Africa from the Carnegie Endowment, and old friends. I'm proud that I can say most of these people are former colleagues and still good friends. So can we start with you, Roberta?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
I'm going to try to be really ruthless about time because all of these guys are too important to stay longer. Please, you can do it.
Thank you. I didn't bring any slides, but
did you bring the slide?
yeah, bring any slides.
Oh, you didn't. That's no, please.
Yeah,
it's an informal discussion where our students get to torture you a little bit.
Oh, very good. So before the torture, can I start setting the stage a little bit?
Please, by all means.
So first of all, thank you for having me here. It's such a pleasure for me to have the opportunity to discuss the economics of a region that is not my own, but that I feel as if it were my own. I think that I've been introduced in a too flattering a way. I'm definitely not the most important.
I forgot
person.
a lot of things about you, including that she was a professor at SAIS for a while.
I was. So it's such a pleasure for me.
The most important part.
I'm here in this incredible building. I used to teach in DuPont Circle. So anyway, definitely I'm not the most important person in the region, but I'm somebody who oversees analytical work in the World Bank region for the Middle East and North Africa. So let me start by setting the stage a little bit on the big picture of what we see in the region, and then I'm sure that you will have a lot of questions and we can have a conversation going on the areas that are of most interest to you. So every 6 months, in conjunction with the annual meetings and spring meetings of the World Bank and the IMF, my office produces an economic update. And this time around, we decided to focus on a key question for our region, at least I think a key question, which is the question of growth. And so we looked at it from different perspectives. And so the typical one is like, what's going to happen in the next 6 months? It's sort of like the short-term outlook. Another perspective that we took was the inevitable one, was the one of conflict. And the third one was to try to see what are areas of optimism in our region. And I don't think you'll be surprised if you know the Middle East and North Africa, that there are many quick wins that could be taken in terms of growth. And I'll try to touch upon these 3 points in sequence. So let me start from the here and now. So the World Bank puts the real GDP growth of the Middle East and North Africa at 2.2%. Does it sound like a lot or little to you? We called it a fragile growth. And as a matter of fact, the region comes from a history of low chronic growth. So this growth is low, and it's definitely much lower than what we predicted in October 2023. What happened between now and then? One, a dramatic war, which really increased uncertainty in the region. Two, significant caps on the production of oil exporting countries. These two factors together really downgraded the forecast of growth in the region. I mentioned uncertainty, and something that I'm kind of proud of is that the team that I work with has really tried to bring a measure to uncertainty. And so what we did is that we looked around, and the World Bank and the IMF are by no means the only institutions that work on the Middle East and North Africa and produce growth projections. And so we looked at the private sector growth projections, and we looked at the discordance among forecasters. It turns out that when you compare our region to the rest of the world, the discordance in forecasting growth is the highest in MENA. And at this point is twice as large than in other emerging and developing economies. Clearly, this increasing uncertainty has to do with the conflict. And let me just put out there a number. By no means brings together the devastation that is happening in the region, but the economy of Gaza has dropped 86% in terms of its GDP in the first half of 2024. And this is in addition to the massive displacement, the near famine conditions of much of the population, and the destruction of infrastructure and housing. I'd be happy to talk more about the immediate impact of war. And I'm being an economist here, and I'm really focusing on what is the most important, the human toll of war and the toll on human capital. But I'll be happy to talk about, if you're interested, on the impact that the war is having also beyond the West Bank and Gaza and Lebanon, where war has escalated very recently. Now, these conflicts are coming at the heel of a clear increase in fragility in the Middle East and North Africa. The number of conflict episodes since the 1990s have doubled. And between 2012 and 2017, the Middle East and North Africa had the largest share of victims of conflict worldwide. So there is clearly a trend, and as I mentioned, there are impacts of conflicts that go way beyond the economics. But let me again give me the privilege of just being an economist here. What my team did was to create a counterfactual of what GDP per capita would have been in economies in the Middle East and North Africa if they hadn't had conflict in the past 30 years. So we looked at 5 key conflicts, and we came to a number that was astonishing to me. So if there hadn't been a conflict in Yemen, Syria, Algeria, Iraq, and the first Intifada in West Bank and Gaza, the GDP per capita in the region would be 45% higher. 45%. That is equivalent to 35 years of development, economic development in the Middle East and North Africa. So those numbers are huge. And so there's something that I really think that we economists need to come to terms with, which is that peace is a fundamental precondition for growth. Now, I know that my time is tight, and so I want to conclude with optimism, of which I can really see a lot for the region in terms of important quick wins. So something that we looked at is we took a sort of historical perspective on the growth in the region and where where that has brought the region. So it turns out that the Middle East and North Africa, which let me just say how it is defined for the World Bank, from Morocco to Lebanon, including the Gulf and Djibouti, but not including some of the country in South Asia or Central Asia, which instead are in the regional definition of the IMF. So our region grew at 1% per capita in the past 50 years. That number is not very large. And it brought the region to only 1/4 of the GDP per capita, which is, I think, a fair measure of well-being of the frontier economy, which in the literature is always considered to be the US. So what is responsible for the differences between what we see in the region now and where the US are? Two fundamental things. One, the employment to population ratios, and two, productivity. So I think 60 to 80% of these differences are attributed to these two factors. When we think about employment to population ratio, the thing that comes to our mind and probably comes to your mind is the incredible potential that bringing women to the labor force can deliver to the region if that were to happen. We ran some numbers, and if the employment to population ratio were to equalize between genders in Egypt, GDP in Egypt would increase by 51%. The second story is about productivity, and you can think about productivity in many ways, but the two fundamental ones are how efficiently you use your resources as an economy and how much you innovate to move the frontier forward. So our region, and particularly countries in the North Africa, do not allocate talent effectively, and they tend to allocate too much talent to the public sector, particularly for women. We are at an employment rate in the public sector of 22%, which is the highest in the world. And with women who are becoming more educated, we tend to have a lot of talent that is absorbed in a public sector that tends to be less effective than its income comparators. The second one, and I'll conclude here, is the story of how can the frontier of economics be pushed forward. And that's a story about innovation and infusion of existing innovation and new inventions. There are many examples of that give me optimism and hope. For example, in Saudi Arabia or the UAE in terms of more patents and more innovation. But it's a long way to go before our region really can reach that potential. To do that, many recipes. One that I want to put out there that will sound kind of nerdy, but I would like you to reflect on is better data access and data availability. Our region is one where to get access to data tends to be much more difficult than in income comparators, and this is a clear barrier to the diffusion of idea. The second one, and this is really the end of my talk, is more trade. Clearly, the Middle East and North Africa have been very important in terms of hydrocarbon worldwide. However, there is a tremendous potential for non-oil trade that still remains untapped. What comes with that potential is to absorb know-how and move the frontier of technology. So although I started with something that brought some pause to me as an economist in terms of the news that one delivers, I really see important opportunities for the region to grow. So let me stop here and happy to answer any questions that you have.
Very informative and very
Where should I?
short.
Where
Please
should I?
sit on
Okay.
the here.
I thought you were very strict with time, so.
I am. I'm trying to be. You were great. Thank you so very much, Roberta. Talene, you have also some insights you want to share with us? And then we'll open the floor to questions.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for SAIS for inviting me as well. I very much look forward to the discussion. So I will try to take a little bit of what Roberta said to put my comments a little shorter. So because there are a lot of overlaps between what the World Bank is seeing and what the IMF is seeing in terms of the economic outlook. Obviously, it's the same region we are talking about, so the issues are similar. Let me first maybe say the annual meetings of the IMF and the World Bank, what dominates the discussion of the MENA region, there were two words: uncertainty and building resilience to fight, to be able to manage this uncertainty. So these were the two words that really came for the region during the annual meeting. And when I go through the outlook of the economic outlook of the region, how we see it, and you will see how this is becoming an important issue for the region. Maybe to summarize the outlook, 3 points. One is there are a lot of challenges in the MENA region. We know the conflict and others, but despite these challenges, we are seeing some resilience in the economies of the region. We are projecting the growth for the MENA at 2.1% for 2024, and for North Africa at 2.2%. So there is this. And the second one is that inflation in most countries has gone down from double digit to single digit. So we are, most countries, of course, there are some countries where inflation is still high. Now, this growth is still very low, as Roberta was saying, it is a fragile growth. And what are the reasons for this growth, this low growth? One is the conflict that we are seeing, but there is conflict in Sudan, which is affecting, Sudan is seeing a double-digit contraction. So the countries that are affected are seeing a contraction. We have Sudan, Lebanon, West Bank, Gaza. These are directly affected countries. Then there are other countries that are affected through spillovers. Again, I mean, like these are like Egypt in North Africa, where we are seeing impact on trade and the Canal Suez revenues, where we've seen almost 70% drop in the Canal Suez revenues. And this is a very important resource for Egypt, both external and fiscal resource. And in Jordan, we've seen a drop in tourism, and that is also another impact. Then there are the broader regional impact, and these are through 3 channels, I would say. Oil and gas prices, financial markets, risk premium, and trade and tourism. So far, despite the devastating impact of the war, we've seen that these indirect channels through the broader region haven't been as, I mean, they have been very temporary and short-lived. The second reason for this low growth is the oil production cuts of the OPEC Plus. And this affects mainly the oil exporting countries, whether it's the GCC countries, but also countries like Algeria and Libya, who are members of the OPEC Plus. And the third factor is more country-specific factors that we see. Here, for instance, in Morocco, we've seen that there has been a drought this year, and there has been so many droughts over the last years in Morocco. And this drought has had an impact on economic growth as well as on unemployment. In Egypt and Tunisia, there have been a lot of economic challenges, which also had an impact on growth. In Sudan, the war. In Libya, there was some temporary shutdown in oil fields. So all these are more country-specific factors, which are mainly North Africa is affected by those factors. The second point I want to make is the rise in uncertainty and the fact that risks are down to the downside. And one is the escalation of conflict. Since the end of the summer, there has been escalation of the Gaza conflict in Lebanon, but there are risks that this escalation can go further to the broader MENA. And if that risk happens, this could have a very important impact on the region. There is more broadly the global geoeconomic fragmentation as well, which is a risk. And this is about the trade protection, the protectionist policies of the big countries that could have an impact on the region as well as on the rest of the world. There are the climate shocks, which have been very recurrent in the MENA. We've seen floods, wildfires, droughts in Morocco, Algeria, Libya, Mauritania. So all these we have seen them. So if these factors, depending on how they will evolve, next year's outlook can be better or not. And the third point I want to make is that even if the next year outlook is positive, over the medium term, as Roberta was saying, our growth projections are showing that the region is, the growth, medium-term growth in the region is fading and is very weak. It is not, I mean, below 4% of GDP is not going to be enough to generate the employment that is needed for the region. And there are, obviously, the conflict is one of the issues for the region's low, medium-term growth. We have also done some similar analysis in our regional economic outlook of April, which shows that the impact of conflict in the region is bigger and more persistent than elsewhere. GDP per capita is 10% lower than pre-conflict after a decade of conflict in the region. And therefore, this is one of the issues. The second issue is, I mean, more about the structural challenges of the region. And here, there is an opportunity for the region to change this dynamics and by working on several reforms. And I want to cite three key ones. One is governance reform. Our analysis shows that the governance reforms can pay off not just in the medium term, but also in the short term, and can amplify the impact of other reforms on the economy. The second is the reducing the state footprint. The region is known by the dominance of the state in the economic activity mainly through state-owned enterprises. And these enterprises are not necessarily the most efficient, and they imply a cost also on the budget. And the third one is the female labor force participation. We've seen, for instance, in countries like Morocco, if you improve the female labor force participation, the impact on the economy is twice as much as other reforms. And this is why, because initially, the labor force participation is low in these countries, and there is a lot of room for that. And the last point I want to make is integration, trade integration, and particularly regional integration. If we consider, for instance, the Maghreb countries, the trade among themselves is less than 5%. So they are all towards other regions, but not among themselves. If they were to open up, they will have a bigger population where they will attract more investment. And we've seen also our analysis show that if this was to happen, after 5 years, they would grow, each of these countries, they would have grown by 1% more if there is more region. So maybe I'll stop here and then happy to take all the questions.
Thank you so very much. Giving us some sobering numbers here and percentages. It's and I admire the fact that you're still optimistic. I mean, as most of you know, the World Bank and the IMF don't get involved in politics. So their entire assessment is always anchored in economic analysis. But Amr is a little bit more free than that. So maybe you can share with us both the economic and also the political impact that you see from this perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Hafs. It's a pleasure to join you, and congratulations on the impressive building. It's my first time in the building. Very, very nice indeed. So we lost you as neighbors since Carnegie is on the opposite side of the street of your old building, but it's truly a nice place you guys have come to be at. Well, let me start by saying what I would like to do in the 10 minutes I have. I would like, first of all, to draw your attention to some of the indirect impacts of war and conflict in the region on the economic situation, because it's while it's extremely relevant to say that in the Middle East and North Africa, trade has been impacted, FDIs have been impacted. In some cases, as in Egypt, the revenues of the Suez Canal have been greatly impacted in Jordan tourism, in Israel tourism, and elsewhere in the region in general. What I believe is not captured in our analysis is the indirect cost of conflict and war on the economies of the region, as well as on some of the issues Talene has just outlined on governance reform, for example, and getting the state out of the economic sector. This is the first point I'm going to address. The second point is going to be more about the geostrategic configuration in the region and why it's extremely challenging from an economic development perspective. Thirdly, I would like to draw, and this is going to be my final point, I would like to draw your attention to some of the demographic shifts we're seeing in the region and their economic and political impact as well. Let me start with the first point on the indirect cost of war and conflict. And what I would like to draw your attention to is away from the fiscal difficulties, economic difficulties, countries in the region, be it countries directly impacted, Palestine, Israel, Lebanon, Yemen, or countries indirectly impacted by proximity, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and elsewhere. I believe one of the most significant indirect costs of war and conflict in the region, and I agree with Talene's description that this region has been in a constant conflict phase since the last decade. We're looking at a decade of conflict, and I'm coming to term it increasingly as a new war of attrition. We used to have a war of attrition back in the 1960s, early 70s, and this is what's happening again. This is a constant state of war, intrastate wars, civil wars, violent conflicts, in civil strife in different ways. The first indirect cost is the fact that it's extremely difficult, structurally difficult for any government in the region as of now to embark on the two prescriptions Talene has just shared, to improve governance and to take the state out of the economic sector. This does not, it's extremely difficult to imagine this happening in a moment of a regional conflict. Governments are facing huge risks. If you speak with policymakers, stakeholders in the region, and rightly they will tell you we cannot prioritize governance reform in a moment in which we're facing dire national security consequences of the war. We cannot prioritize getting state corporations out of the private sector in a moment of too many risks facing even the delivery of and the providence of basic needs to the population. Inflation rates, if they are coming down now, were extremely difficult in the last years. I mean, they were in the double digits, as both of you have rightly mentioned. The second, so the first indirect cost of war and conflict is the fact that I'm seeing a wave of deprioritization, regional deprioritization of governance reform and of getting state corporations out of the economic sector. And I believe it's extremely difficult to push for otherwise in a moment of regional instability. Second point, if you look at the last 10 years in the region, we had maybe I would say between 2014 and 2017, 18, countries in the region were engaging in pushing forward visions for their futures, right? I mean, we had a flurry of visions coming out of different capitals in the region, 2030 in Saudi Arabia, a vision for the future in Egypt, in the UAE, in Morocco, and elsewhere. And I believe when I look at the details of the implementation of these visions, and some parts of it are under implementation in different ways, I believe there are new challenges related to the fact that conflicts are pushing some countries to readjust, to rediscuss their priorities. So Egypt is facing, for example, a massive loss in revenues from the Suez Canal and from tourism. And as a result, there are some delays in the implementation of the economic and social vision that has been under implementation since several years. I believe the same is happening to an extent in Saudi Arabia. Some shifts are happening in Morocco as well. So a second indirect cost is
basically to get a distraction. I mean, we are seeing governments and civil societies in the region becoming structurally distracted because of the cost of conflict and war. Third point is there's a big difference between looking at a region in which geostrategic risks are negligible, like Latin America, for example, or as a geostrategic region, or at a region which geostrategic risks are only on the rise, and where you do not know what kind of situation you will wake up tomorrow to find. I mean, I was extremely interested to see the discourse, the evolution of the discourse here in the US regarding the war on Gaza and whether the war on Gaza will become a regional war or not. And I believe many in policy circles outside were in denial. The war has already become a regional war, and everyone was still saying, well, the key priority of the US administration, key priority of Western governments is to avoid the expansion of the war to become a regional, but it's come to be a regional war already. And this discourse, the denial discourse, is interesting to take note of. I believe from a regional perspective, it simply means that this strategic uncertainty which we are going through, or the new war of attrition, as I'm calling it, because too many fronts, too many actors around, I believe is weighing heavy on economic developmental models, on the implementation of inclusive models in governance, social safety schemes, in spite of the fact that many countries in the region, non-oil exporting countries, were scoring quite well at those fronts prior to the war in Gaza. Morocco, Egypt, Tunisia to an extent, Lebanon, Jordan. There were some impressive improvements at the governance level prior to the outbreak of the Gaza war, as well as with regard to some side components of developmental models, especially social safety schemes, green economies, and what have you. So the first point is the indirect cost of wars, which I'm putting forward a plea to take it into consideration, not only to look at the direct cost of war. Second point, I believe that this region is also facing a second dilemma, which is the fact that we are looking at, it's probably, as of now, when I look worldwide, this is the worst case worldwide. We used to have it before in regions such as the Balkans, Central Asia for some time, different African countries in previous decades. But this region no longer has only state actors operating or defining its geostrategic map. It has a second set or a subset of actors which cannot be held accountable to the same rational decision-making processes and procedures we normally would have nation-state actors or state actors accountable to. And my reference is to non-state actors. And this duality of state and non-state actors, I believe, is difficult and is one of the reasons why we're not seeing a great deal of states plugging themselves out of economic sectors or opening up polities or introducing governance reforms, because they are facing competition, sometimes outright conflict with non-state actors. This duality of state and non-state actors, I believe, is a hindrance to governance reform, to economic reform, and is one of the most difficult geostrategically to tackle, because it has come to be embedded in different social fabrics. And I'm not only referring to the case of Palestine and Lebanon, but I'm also referring to the case of Sudan, unfortunately an unreported case with a huge human cost of state, non-state conflict between a government as unstable as it may have been prior to the outbreak of the war almost 2 years ago, and a set of non-state actors, militarized militias, militia groups operating, causing a civil war with a huge spillover effect on Egypt and elsewhere. The second point. Third point, and here I'm going to end, is when I look ahead, and while I completely embrace Taline's suggestions as to prioritizing governance reform, how important governance reform is, the inclusion of the female labor force, and in the case of I can also add energy for the green economy and transition in the green economy and the innovation which is happening not only in oil exporting countries, but in non-oil exporting countries as well. Egypt and Morocco have gone a long way in terms of their renewable energy projects, especially in recent years. However, when I look at the region, and keep in mind the figures and numbers which were just shared by Roberta and Talim, I am in doubt that the region will be able to perform better in the coming years unless its regional security has been reestablished. And I'm adding to that the fact that this is going to be on regional actors. When I look at global shifts in general and the growing tendencies in the US and elsewhere, and how the US, I'm not only referring to the upcoming administration, but in general, how the Middle East is being looked at by the US, China, the Europeans, Russia. I believe it's going to be on regional governments to figure out a way of restabilizing, of coming up with a security and stability pact for the region. I keep referring to the impressive example of the Europeans in the 1970s and 1980s, the Organization for Security Cooperation, which emerged back in the 1970s in the context of the Cold War, and how it pacified the continent and enabled or continued the pacification of the continent and enabled greater trade between the former Eastern Bloc and Western countries. A similar stability pact in the region is needed. And it takes the participation of 6 countries, which I'm going to outline and then stop. Egypt, because it's my beloved home country, so I mentioned it first, of course. Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Israel. Without coordination of sorts between the 6 countries, such a regional stability pact, which is ultimately the solution to attend to the indirect cost of war and conflict, minimize the duality of state and non-state actors, will not happen. Thank you so much.
I agree with these 6 countries except the UAE. I think it actually can be more problematic than actually add to the security. Anyway, thank you all very, very much. I'm gonna try to move along quickly because some of our colleagues need to get back to their offices. So I'll open it to questions. Please go ahead and I'll call on you. Please address your question to either the specific person or to the group as a whole. It'd be great also if you can introduce yourselves first. Please, 1, 2, 3.
Hi everyone, I'm Nassim. I'm a second year MAIR here at SAIS. Thank you all for your time and your insights, and it's been incredibly well insightful. And so thinking about how many of you mentioned trade and the future of trying to bolster trade in the region and integration, wondering what the practical steps look like for non-oil exporting countries, as a large majority of their economies tend to be in non-tradable sectors, and how to develop those economies to then move into that next phase of trade integration.
Any specific person you're addressing this to?
I guess to Roberta and Taline, since they mentioned it, but anyone can chime in as well.
Should we take 3 questions or?
Actually, yeah, it's better. This way we can group them. Yes, your second.
Thank you so much for coming to speak with us. I have a question about Lebanon. So I'm wondering how the current war has affected the economic prognosis for Lebanon, adding on to, as we all know, a very already problematic economic crisis. And I think, and my a follow-up question is, what could the consequences be of the economic consequences of the war in Lebanon?
Okay, please.
Thank you very much. Ismet Fatih Chanchar here. I'm a visiting Fulbright researcher. You've talked, I think Ms. Roberta talked about this, about the economy of Gaza and the reduction 86% of GDP in the first 6 months. Have you guys, either IMF or World Bank, did any forecasting, any analysis, crunch some numbers on how would reconstruction and rebuilding of Gaza look like? What is the scope and the amount? How would that look like? Especially given the absolute devastation of the human capital and the productivity of the state of Palestine in that sense? What is the actual economic tools and amounts that one should employ in order to at least partially bring back Gaza to life? Thank you very much.
Please, let's start. Talene, do you want to start?
Sure.
I'll leave any political questions to Amr.
Gladly, there is none. I mean, this is on Talene and Roberta this time.
Yeah, let's focus on.
Okay. Okay, maybe first on the trade. I think there is the region is known for its non-trade barriers, high non-trade barriers, and also high tariffs. So there is a lot of already protectionism in the region. Opening up this is one of the steps that are going to be important. When we look at Morocco, Morocco gives a good example of also integration in value chains, and that is also another area. But I mean, when I also mentioned that the regional part of the trade, because the region can generate a lot of additional trade to itself. So this is what I would say. And then on Lebanon, I want to just say that it is a devastating situation. One is that, of course, I mean, other than the casualties that we are seeing, more than 1 million of the population is displaced, and this is creating a lot of economic challenges. What we are seeing is that there will be another year of contraction in the economy, and this is going to be a big challenge because it comes on top of already a difficult, economic situation that has been ongoing since 2019. Action for you?
Happily.
Please.
So let me just make a few considerations to complement the very good things that Talene said, and then I'm happy to talk a little bit about Gaza. So the trade and integration, first of all, I think that there's a sense in which no matter how difficult these reforms might be at this very point in time, countries in the Middle East and North Africa, and particularly North Africa, need to invest in improving the ease of doing business, which really relates to that very good point that Talene was making, which is to reduce the footprint of the state. I think, and I don't want to put words into your mouth, but let me take those words onto myself. I don't think reducing the footprint of the states really means privatizing. It means changing the role that the state has in the economy from a sort of top-down to an enabler of business. And so this is something that would organically improve the opportunity for countries to be more present on the trade landscape, be more integrated. Of course, when non-tariff and tariff barriers are sort of those, that's the first barrier. I don't mean it as a pun, but are taken care of. So the opportunities for non-oil are particularly for tradable services. This is something where, you could see that, the North Africa is in the same time zone of the EU. If the EU were to grow, there is a tremendous opportunity for non-tradable services. There's something that we don't talk very much about when we talk about integration, and that's migration. And I think Amer was talking about the demographic development of the region. And something that we can't forget is that the North Africa is just on the southern rim of an aging region that needs people. And the North Africa is a very young region. So there needs to be also a better understanding to create channels for legal migration that really helps integrating people and make them productive. Talene spoke about the devastation that is happening in Lebanon, and I just wanted to point to you something that was issued last Thursday from the World Bank, which is an assessment of the damage that has happened so far to infrastructure, which has been set at 8.5 billion, with the housing being the most destroyed. But this is just one part of what is happening. Rebuilding Gaza. So if I can speak for the World Bank, I see my institution trying to get ready for the day after. Is going to be a complicated moment because the destruction is not only the infrastructure, and some of you might have seen something called the interim damage assessment, and in March, only for the damage that happened to infrastructure up to January, the amount was put at $18.5 billion. Of course, this damages is much more intense, and really it affects human capital. Think about that there are 685,000 children who have not been in school for more than a year. In my previous life, I was involved in building something called the Human Capital Index, and you can even do the math, again, being, just thinking about from a point of productivity of the loss that will happen. Of course, that reconstruction on the infrastructure will need to happen, bringing together donors, coming with a sort of grassroots type of approach rather than a top-down one, and one that takes into consideration the incentive of people that they try to rebuild their lives around this devastation. Let me conclude on the fact that we cannot underplay the devastation that is happening on the human capital side. It's not only the lack of schooling, but we know that the lack of nutrition is particularly dramatic in terms of the impact that it has on small children. And this will affect not only their future as human beings, but also their productivity. So all these different aspects will need to be taken care of, hopefully by an international community that sees the value of helping Gaza come back to life again.
Thank you very much. I mean, I don't want to take time. I mean, I'm just reducing my role here to just the secretarial, but I think you pointed out to two really key issues. One is the migration and its impact both on Europe and on the region, and the second thing that you mentioned was also about the that increasing the role of government doesn't mean reducing the role of government doesn't mean privatization, which has accumulated a lot of baggage, as you know, that there is a different organic way to go about it. Amr, do you have any comments on these questions?
Only on one point, on the demographic shifts in the region, because as I was rushing to end my remarks, I failed to mention it. One of the challenges that have been with us in the region for some time and is taking, in a way, even from a policy perspective, is getting more significance due to the outbreak of different wars and conflicts in the region, is of course a question of migration, displacement, and immigration. I mean, the complex of what has been happening in North Africa as well as in the Middle East. And the point which I would like to draw your attention to is the fact that I'm seeing in the region the rise of nativist populist discourses, which is extremely worrying to me. I have never seen it before, and it's not happening only in one country, it's happening across the region in different ways. And it targets, of course, the weakest and the most vulnerable segment of the respective population. And once again, to my mind, this is even more of an incentive for key regional actors, for key regional states to sit down and figure out a stability pact. Otherwise, I'm afraid that the rise and the uptick in nativist and populist discourses would emulate, unfortunately, most of what's happening elsewhere in Europe and North America and elsewhere, and take the region in a direction which is going to be very challenging, especially if we factor in the fact that governments and civil societies are already challenged managing the big influx of displaced. It's not only Lebanon, it's Egypt with the influx from Sudan, it's different North African countries, influx from African countries, and this is a geostrategic risk for the region that needs to be looked at.
I agree entirely. I'm going to take one more round of questions and then we'll turn to Dr. Valley to conclude. I'm sorry, I can't take all of these questions, but let's start with you. And then I'll take two or three more.
I'm going to keep my question short. It's directed to the representative of the IMF. You highlighted the importance of government's reforms, reducing the state economic footprint and increasing female labor force participation. as a critical structure challenges, but these often face resistance tied to political systems and cultural norms in the MENA region. How does the IMF ensure its recommendation in the MENA region are effective given past criticism to the IMF interventions, and what lessons has the IMF learned from previous interventions of the MENA region?
Second, yes, please. We need to do gender balance, so please, yes, you.
Me. Hi, sorry, my name is Sophie. Thank you so much for speaking to us today. I was curious how significant you think the inflow of remittances will be in the future of economic growth for the region. In addition, I'm curious how you think, if at all, the importance of oil exporting countries in the Gulf, trying to diversify their economies in terms of impacting, if at all, the flow of remittances. I'm thinking about to countries like Lebanon and Egypt. Thanks.
One more question, please, Seema.
Hi, my name is Seema. I'm a student here. It's two-part, but kind of related. The 2.1 or 2.2%, I imagine many numbers come in it, and there's a disparity between countries. If we put in Saudi Arabia and any country from the Levant, that's, like probably negative growth. So to what extent do you think this is this makes sense for the midterm, I guess, economic outlook, if we don't separate these to understand exactly how sobering the real numbers are in North Africa, in the Levant, and more of the Gulf, and maybe Turkey. The other question, the political systems in different countries, it's not in their best interest to reform governance. It's not in their best interest to provide, and Roberta talked about data, to provide like real data about what's going on in their country. And I see that in any analysis I want to do for a course, like how do I get numbers? And I want to speak a little bit about that as well, and how does it go in the economic outlook?
Okay, let's start with you, Talene, and then we'll. I'm sorry, I'm rushing everybody, but I'm really committed to making sure that we don't go beyond 12 or maybe 12:05 if I can push it a little. Talene?
Okay, so maybe very quickly, I want to go through this. One is about the IMF advice or these reforms that are critical for the region, how to get the traction. I think it is very important to first mention that economic reforms are the decisions of the authorities of the countries, of the government of the countries. And they will need to be convinced. And past lessons show that the highest level of commitment, the ownership of the authorities of these reforms are very important for the success of these reforms. And this is something we have really incorporated in our way of thinking over time. And when we design, for instance, when we provide lending to countries, we try, and this is very important for us, to have the country develop its own economic policies, its reform program, so that there is really enough ownership in order for them to succeed with its reforms. There are always vested interests, and in this case, in these reforms, because some people are benefiting. For instance, if we think about the energy subsidies, the richest people, the percentiles of the richest percentiles, are the ones that benefit the most of the energy subsidies. And these are people who may not want to have this reform. What we try to do is obviously to do the analysis, to put out the information so that there is some debate. And we also encourage domestic debate for this to happen. But it is a very challenging issue, you are right, in order to get the traction of this reforms. Remittances. Remittances is a very important part of the growth in the region, and I think it will remain so. I mean, partly if we think about the conflicts imply also people migration, and this migration will imply also continued remittances. And the Gulf countries are quite linked in that sense also to the region. One issue I want to mention that diversification in the Gulf countries is showing some results. We are seeing that despite the oil production cuts that has been happening in the GCC countries, the growth is being, we're seeing higher growth in the non-oil sectors. And this is partly because of the reforms that have taken over time in these countries. And of course, I mean, when we look at the broader region, we need to separate. And when we separate, and in our outlook, we look at various country groups, the conflict countries, the ones that are the oil exporters, particularly the GCC itself. But then there are also another group of countries who are not necessarily in conflict, but they have, for instance, these are more emerging markets like Egypt, Jordan, Morocco, Tunisia, etc. Those are countries where also debt is not, there is high debt, which is generating some burden on these economies. And then you have the low-income countries, which are not necessarily in conflict, but they are also low-income. So each of these groups have a bit of a different, there are differences among them in terms of the economic challenges also they are facing. And I think this, finally, I mean, I mentioned about there was a question about the political system and the information, and I think that is the importance from our side to put out the information as much as possible so that we can clarify to the populations what are the implications of certain policies and to create some debate internally. So I'll stop here.
Thank you. Roberta and Anne, quickly.
Let me just add two considerations. One, which I think that Tallinn makes a very good point, that our region, if we think about growth forecast, is so heterogeneous. So that two considerations when you look at this regional forecast. First of all, these are GDP weighted. So when we produce a forecast, there are 3 countries that really will change those numbers. Guess which ones in the region? Saudi Arabia, Egypt. You can't answer those questions. And
Morocco, I would say no.
Iran. Those are the 3 countries. So if growth changes in those 3 countries, you see the aggregate change. Of course, if you look at GCC countries, Tallinn was right. They went from like 0.5% to 1.9% from 2023 to 2024, and it was all non-oil. And so we see great diversification. We still need to see how that will unfold because there's lots of fiscal injection. There's a lot of oil money that is injected into the non-oil sector with industrial policies of different nature that really sustains that part. But I just wanted to leave you with a number if we want to think about growth in the medium term, which is we did kind of like back of the envelope math for the region to just get halfway to where the US are right now. It will need to grow in terms of income per capita at 3.8% per year, which is like almost 4 times what it grew in the past 30 years. So there is a sense in which no matter how difficult these reforms are, they need to happen to really change from business as usual. And I want to conclude on something that I embraced as like my mandate, and I don't know well I'll succeed as I am in this job, which is really to help improve data openness. And I do understand that there are many considerations of political economy around it. But when uncertainty is high, you really want to cross the river by feeling the stones. And you can't feel the stones if you don't have data. So something that we're trying to do with different type of incentives, sometimes by showcasing that nothing happens to your economy if you open up data. So, in economies that are fully developed, you have data openness and protocols for accessing anonymized data within the laws of privacy that is respected, and nothing happens to those economies. So there's a sense in which it might be a jump, but it's a jump that does not carry costs. As a matter of fact, it carries benefits. And two colleagues of mine just published a paper showing that when data are open through different channels, lower spreads, better policy, more targeted intervention, GDP can increase to the tune of 6.7 percentage points. So this is something to which I'm dedicating building my outreach in the region. And I know that in Tallinn and all the colleagues at the IMF, I have great support for that. Anyway, thank you for that question.
I can testify that the World Bank has been taking this. I worked there and I know this, that it's been going on for a long time. The World Bank has been really at the forefront of trying to open even its own data, its own information about projects, assessments, all of that. So I would encourage, I'm sure the IMF is the same. I will encourage you to actually go to the websites of these two institutions. I think you will find an enormous amount of information, case studies, and so on that you would like. Amr?
Yes, so I'm a political scientist by training, and I've spent most of my life teaching political science. So while I do take general recommendations regarding opening up and freedom of information and data collection and sharing seriously, and I embrace them, I always look at what's feasible on the ground. I look at the region and I see three categories of countries. In one of them, we have no access to data. I mean, if you go to Yemen, for example, I mean, we're not having but very, very little information collected by state institutions, by government agencies, due to the fact that this is a country which has been going through civil war for a very long time, and the capacity of state authorities, of government institutions to collect data on the ground is highly hindered and minimized. And I believe in this one category, I would place countries like Yemen, Libya, Sudan, to an extent Syria, to an extent Lebanon, where whenever I hear about the Lebanese economy, I always ask myself, whose economy is it exactly? Is it the government's economy? Is it Hezbollah's economy? Is it a different non-state actors' economy? And the same applies to other countries. But we have one bucket of countries in the region where the big question of data and information is a highly political question and is really down to the duality of state and non-state actors or realities of civil wars. Second bucket is countries which have been doing better in terms of opening up and sharing information. And this does not have to go hand in hand with democratic reforms or governance reforms. Sometimes it does, sometimes it does not. The UAE, most numbers which you get out of the UAE, I believe, on economic and social issues are credible. They take the transparency and accountability component of their job and their delivery to citizens very seriously. And Egypt and Morocco have been doing that as well. So now you can use numbers which are put out by agencies, government agencies in Morocco and Egypt on the green economy, on renewable energy projects, on unemployment, on social safety schemes, and take them seriously. They do not invent numbers. And then you have a third bucket where it's a black box and we don't know much, apart from what gets released by virtue of a ruler's decision. I'm not going to name names. But once again, this is sort of a key issue that we have to keep in mind. There is no one size fits it all in the region because political realities on the ground are extremely complex.
I'll just add one question. In my experience, there was one country that will stay unnamed that thought all of these data is considered national security issues and will not be released. Now let's flip it. I mean, Roberta has a question for you guys.
I have a question for you because this question of data that Amra has actually delved into very nicely has an example where there is an economy that has not only collected data on all the key elements like household surveys, price surveys, economic establishment, and so on, but made them available on their website like a typical middle-income country would do. Which economy do you think it would be in the Middle East and North Africa?
But Iran.
Actually, so that means there's two. Iran is almost there, and you're very right. So Iran is a country where we actually are able, as scientists, as researchers, to actually work on the data. There's another.
Bahrain by any chance?
Palestinian territories.
Wow.
Axis of resistance, doing very well.
Yes, and so there's not only statistical capacity, but also the willingness to have researchers working on those data. Of course, you know, this was.
Answer, I didn't really expect that to. But
Yeah,
it's really, it speaks a lot for.
It speaks a lot in terms of it is possible if there is the will
Yeah.
to put it out there. And you're very right that on Iran, we're fortunate to be able to understand the economy much better than we can for other countries in the region. Anyway.
I'll turn to Vali for concluding remarks, and then I'll come to thank you and set you on your way for lunch.
Well, thank you very much. That was a truly very rich discussion, and I learned a lot listening to Roberta and Taline. They provided a very eye-opening picture of where the economies of the region are and what are the possibilities of growth, and also what are the challenges. And I think Amar provided a very sobering view of what the main political security obstacles there are. But and I would say that, you know, listening to them, this is clearly an ongoing picture, because even the conflicts in the region are not yet done. We don't know where the dust will settle and then what will come after. So I hope we'll continue on this. But I would just say, you know, listening to the panel, it clearly we focused on on how the conflicts basically limit the ability to change the economies of the region. But I also came to think that, you know, there's also another scenario in which the absence of economic change in the region is the reason for conflict. I mean, the region seems to be bookended between Arab Spring and the Gaza war, and Arab Spring was actually a cause of great deal of insecurity in the region, and its roots were economic. So I wonder whether even past the Gaza war, we will be back to another episode of Arab Spring, if the picture that was painted here does not actually change by omission or commission. Anyways, thank you very much. This was truly thought-provoking, and thank you.
I agree with Vali, but it's not going to be an Arab Spring like the last one. I think it's going to be a far worse version of it. And I think the anger and the disappointments and the economic situation in the region has created a generation that's not going to be out asking for democracy or human rights, but it will be out for revenge. Anyway, thank you all very much. I thank my colleagues and lovely to see you, Amr, again after all these years. Thank you, Vali. We have lunch outside, but one last thing. For the two ladies from these institutions, we have a great cohort of students. So if they send you their resumes looking for internships or there is a huge, by the way, SAIS alumni in both institutions. Roberta was just telling you before how many SAIS people she had hired, but these are great institutions. I spent a long time of my life there, and I could tell you they are really unique institutions because of their people, not because of anything else. You learn enormous amounts there. So thank you all very much, and please.